After America is made on the lands of the Kure, Wurrung, Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples, we acknowledge that they and their ancestors have cared for the lands, rivers and sea, and all living creatures for thousands of generations. We pay our respects to elders past and present and acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded.
We are in a battle for the soul of America.
This is a fraud on the American public.
Hi, I'm Emma Shortis, and this is After America. Over the weekend, the US Court of Appeals ruled that most of Trump's tariffs are illegal. The president's response was more or less, so what?
He just posted seconds ago, all tariffs are still in effect. Today, a highly partisan appeals court incorrectly said that our tariffs should be removed, but they know the United States of America will win in the end. For many years, tariffs were allowed to be used against us by our uncaring and unwise politicians. Now, with the help of the United States Supreme Court, we will use them to the benefit of our nation and make America rich, strong, and powerful again. Thank you for your attention.
Trump clearly feels that he has the freedom to do whatever he wants. And he has reason. Congress isn't holding him to account. He has the Senate and the Supreme Court. And in July last year, that court ruled that a president has immunity for official acts. What they are isn't clear. So what might not be too far off. But this march towards an imperial presidency isn't new. As our guest today argues, since 9/11, Trump's predecessors have consolidated power in the Oval Office, particularly in foreign policy and national security. Trump is extraordinary because he's more willing to exploit and expand that power than anyone who came before. And he's doing it everywhere, all at once. To talk about how we got here and Trump's imperial presidency, we're really pleased to welcome a new guest to the show this week. Elizabeth Saunders is a professor of political science at Columbia University and a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. She is the author of The Insider's Game: How Elites Make War and Peace. Here's Elizabeth now. Thank you so much for joining us on After America.
Thank you so much for having me.
It's our pleasure, and quite amazing that we've managed to catch you while you're actually in Australia. So I wanted to begin, I suppose, by asking you, as a close observer of the Trump administration and the Trump administration's foreign policy, what it's been like to briefly look back at that from the outside, from a traditional ally of the United States.
Yeah, it's been quite an amazing week. I was here for a workshop at the University of Sydney, and I did feel a bit like a skunk at the picnic, because I do think that while quite a lot of the news has flowed across, and people are very well informed, of course, the sort of pervasive sense of dread that we all feel every morning waking up, I don't think quite has made it this far.
Mm-hmm.
I teach at Columbia University, as you may know, but I still live in Washington, D.C. for complicated reasons. And we are dealing with the National Guard deployed on the street. And it's, it's scary to parents. It's scary to kids. It's scary to all citizens. And, I have wonderful colleagues who study comparative politics around the world, and they have great explanations for how this works and why it happens and what the best strategies of resistance are. And they're sort of used to observing this in other countries. But as citizens in the United States, we aren't used to this. And it's been extremely unsettling. And I do know that there are many groups in the United States that suffer persecution and violence from the state or the police on a regular basis. So I don't mean to dismiss the experience of those groups, but there is something very odd about the sight of massed, often unmarked, you can't tell what agency they're from, troops or agents, federal agents, who are looking for people to arrest. It's just a different dynamic, and it's very new, and it's very scary.
It is very scary. And I think it's really interesting that in your experience of Australia, you haven't picked up that sense of dread that you described, because I think it does exist in Australia. It's just outside of, I think, particular policy circles, much as it is in the United States. And I'd really like to come back to that. But just before we do, you kind of hinted at the long history of uneven persecution in the United States. And that really leads me to ask you about an article you wrote recently in Foreign Affairs, where you argued that Trump is behaving like an emperor, but that this crisis and his ability to do that has been decades in the making. So how did we get here to this point of such dread?
Yeah, when I was writing that piece, I was trying to walk a difficult tightrope, because I do think that the proximate cause is a president who is willing to break norms and push power to its absolute limits. But the way I sort of think about this is the systematic dismantling of our checks and balances, right? The American Constitution is set up to try to be self-correcting, to have different forces that can balance out abuses of power by other branches, or correct them or remove them from power. So Congress is supposed to oversee the executive branch and also confirm judges. In the judicial branch, you have judicial oversight of laws, and you have judicial review of laws and of executive actions in some cases. And over time, these have just all been stripped away, but also willingly given away by the other branches. And that, to me, is really the thing that's the most shocking. So I wouldn't say that this necessarily started on 9/11 or after 9/11, because, if you want to go all the way back, there are some who would date the explosive growth of the federal government, and in particular the executive branch, to the post-World War II era, and in particular the dawn of the nuclear age, because the management of nuclear weapons and associated policies like extended deterrence, which is a phrase very familiar to security studies scholars, maybe not everyone. So the idea that we could extend our nuclear umbrella to allies in Europe and Asia, that apparatus, that national security apparatus, required ever more people to run it and staff it. And Congress went along with that for a variety of reasons scholars have looked at. But there was still, during the Cold War, a fair amount of legislative oversight. It paid politically during the Cold War, if you were a member of Congress, to be an expert on foreign policy or national security, to call the president out for abuses, or to challenge the correctness of the policy, right? And so you did have public debate and elite debate in Congress about major national security decisions. There was a gradual weakening of that over time, but then when 9/11 happened, you had a dramatic increase of the granting of power to the president to address terrorism. And that undid some of the reforms that had happened after Watergate and the Vietnam War. But it also went further and affirmatively granted the president new powers of surveillance and, compromises of civil liberties and that sort of thing. And the problem is that tends to be a one-way ratchet, right? It's easy to grant, and it's very difficult politically to take it away. And so no president, no member of Congress, no Congress as a body has been willing to claw back that power. And so I think combined then with extreme partisan polarization that has engulfed our politics, including our foreign policy, and the fact that the Supreme Court is now, stacked in one party's favor.
And has effectively granted the president immunity for official acts.
Exactly. Yeah. And so it's this remarkable, we essentially don't have a functioning legislature anymore. There is not oversight. There's barely scrutiny of nominees. Only a couple got any sort of, only a couple of the nominees reached the point where their confirmation was even in question, much less blocked. And so you have a permissive environment that essentially depends entirely on the goodwill and restraint of the occupant of the Oval Office. And presidents have abused power, And we can debate who has abused the power and whether certain actions in certain presidencies are abuses of power. But until Trump, nobody tried systematically to completely break down the remaining guardrails. And so we are now in a situation where we don't have formal checks and balances anymore.
I mean, there are obviously those clear through lines, I suppose, when it comes to foreign policy and the exercise of power between Trump and presidents past. But am I right to think that you are arguing that Trump is exercising that power available to him differently to other presidents when it comes to foreign policy?
Yes, I think it's just a question of thinking about it as he's pushing on an open door, right? The conditions are available to him, and they were, to some extent, they were in the first term, but there were some remaining. You did still have institutionalists who were in his cabinet who came from Congress or the military, who really believed in the American system and would check. They enabled some of his, impulses that we might find abhorrent, but they also checked some of the most extreme policies. And I think after January 6th, which was a real watershed turning point, there were certainly, Trump attempted to push against the guardrails, and many of them did bend, but they didn't really break. And then we had January 6th. But the fact that he was able to come back from that, even after the January 6th hearings, I think that he's made very clear he's not going to tolerate any dissent. And he's in the foreign policy realm. He just fired the director of I believe the director of the Defense Intelligence Agency, because he gave the assessment of the Iran bombing, the bunker buster bombs, that Trump didn't, that it wasn't a complete obliteration. And Trump didn't like that, right? And I just saw this morning there's been more purges of Russia experts after the Alaska summit from the CIA. And this is not my area at all, but there's a brewing, I saw just as of this morning, controversy over the the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, which is the main agency that deals with infectious disease and vaccinations and so forth. And their director is being ousted, and then there's a flood of resignations surrounding that of deep expertise that is being completely lost in the federal government across so many different issues.
Yeah, it's wild and, as you say, very scary.
We will be a nation like no other, full of compassion, courage, and exceptionalism. Our power will stop all wars and bring a new spirit of unity to a world that has been angry, violent, and totally unpredictable. We will measure our success not only by the battles we win, but also by the wars that we end, and perhaps most importantly, the wars we never get into.
But, I mean, part of the reason people supported Trump in both, the first time around and in the most recent election was because he did promise to do foreign policy differently. He promised to dismantle the deep state. He promised to end the forever wars. He successfully pitched himself as the anti-war candidate. Now, that's obviously not true. And I mean, you will have seen in recent days, he's musing about renaming the Department of Defense to the Department of War. But it points to how fed up so many Americans had become with US foreign policy and the exercise of American power. Why do you think it is that Trump hasn't responded to that? Why is it that he hasn't ended the forever wars and is more likely, as you've argued recently, to start new ones?
Well, I think in fairness, Trump did try to end the war in Afghanistan. And he was the one who struck the deal with the Taliban at the very end of his term. And this is one of those areas where Trump and Biden, I think, were in agreement. And of course, Trump attacked Biden for the terrible, tragic, chaotic way that the U.S. left Afghanistan, which is somewhat different from the basic premise that we should have left. That there was actually a rare moment of consensus, I think, in Washington that it was time for that war to end. I think the real issue is that many of the there's a lot of sort of talk about how there was no accountability for the forever wars, for the Iraq War, for the war in Afghanistan. And I think that's right. And I think it's probably because at the very end of the when Obama took over, he decided he didn't want to dwell on the past, but also there was the financial crisis of 2008 and 9. And, that sucked up all the bandwidth that otherwise might have gone to a reckoning with the mistakes, the foreign policy mistakes of the past. And so I think there's this festering feeling that those same people are still around, but, there's not a recognition that there's a multitude of threats. These are complicated issues. I mean, one could be opposed to the Iraq War, but still have a job inside an agency where we're in the Iraq War and you want to, on any given day, your job is to try to protect American troops, gather intelligence. Like, you have to just deal with the situation that you're in. And so not everyone who participated in that is necessarily an architect of this policy that deserves, to be held accountable for its initiation, right? And I think it's the problem with Trump is that he can't, or a problem with Trump is that he can't seem to differentiate between I am against long wars in the Middle East, although he does like to bomb things, right? And I must get rid of all people with expertise who have worked in these agencies for like more than 6 months, which is an exaggeration, but it's not far off. I mean, he's really gutted. I mean, it's quite frightening, actually. He took no Russia experts with him to Alaska. So, combined with his love of authoritarian regimes and personalist dictators in general, Kim Jong-un, Xi Jinping, Vladimir Putin, it's a bad combination that doesn't really allow him to make good on the policy promises that he put forth. Again, he also likes to look tough. And if he's anti-war but wants to look tough and people aren't giving him accurate or their best guess at what's an accurate intelligence assessment, then it's just very noisy, and that's going to produce more sort of erratic decision making. So you're going to get these wars even if he's potentially in his heart of hearts doesn't really want to start them.
Yeah, okay. And I suspect as well, because he's not, he bills himself as a peacemaker, but he's not particularly interested in the work that is required to build genuine peace.
No, and we've seen that over and over again, right? At the time of the North Korea summit, the very first, the Singapore summit, there were Asia experts who said, look, it's a little strange that he's granted this summit to Kim, which is what Kim Jong-un really wants, legitimacy and so forth. But given that North Korea has nuclear weapons and is not likely to ever give them up willingly under this regime, it is worth having a conversation about a deal where you could have verification and, let's count how many they have. Let's have a hotline. Let's, things that are not necessarily arms control or disarmament, but things that keep, that are stabilizing. And there was none of that preparation, none of that spade work that was done ahead of that summit. And they didn't even get that much, right? The Singapore summit didn't achieve much of anything. And the same, I think, is true of the Ukraine war, right? He just wants a deal, any deal. And I don't think he cares that much about the details. And so that is what I think, prompted the Europeans to fly en masse to Washington last week, because they were worried about the sort of downside risk of him just giving away the store for the sake of making a deal.
Which is entirely possible.
They seem to have succeeded in the short run, at least, right? So in that sense, they were successful, but that they even had to do that is, you don't give away summits like candy.
Yeah. And they were arguably successful, but it's not clear for how long, how long that success can be maintained.
As you all know, Chicago's a killing field right now. And they don't acknowledge it. And they say, we don't need him, freedom. He's a dictator. A lot of people are saying maybe we like a dictator. I don't like a dictator. I'm not a dictator. I'm a man with great common sense and I'm a smart person. I would have much more respect for Pritzker if he'd call me up and say, I have a problem. Can you help me fix it? I would be so happy to do it. I don't love, not that I don't have the right to do anything I want to do. I'm the president of the United States. If I think our country's in danger, and it is in danger in these cities, I can do it.
You mentioned there, Trump's relationships with authoritarian leaders, but you've also written about Trump's own particular kind of authoritarianism. We had the spectacle of him in the Oval Office just this week, musing about how he's not a dictator, but many people have suggested that they might like a dictator. How do you understand Trump's authoritarianism? And I mean, it sounds to me like you're very worried about the present and the future of American democracy under Trump.
Yeah, I am. And I mean, I think he just has a natural impulse towards trying to look tough and, very much wanting to be able to order things and have them carried out, no matter what they are. And some of that is relatively benign. The gilding of the Oval Office, we've seen that in that sort of time lapse with all these leader visits. There's more and more gold. Is that going to break American democracy? No. But I think his expectation that he can get whatever he wants is, first of all, bumping up against less and less resistance from the major institutions that you'd expect, including universities and law firms and, business. Even the stock market seems, which is, I have no expertise in whatsoever, but it's, basic laws of gravity. It's sort of seems odd that in the face of these attacks on the Federal Reserve and all sorts of other the tariffs we haven't even mentioned, right? Things that are clearly harmful to the economy in the short and the long term. The market seemed immune to it, right? And so there's no forces pushing back on his general impulse. And, if he would like to have a paramilitary force walking the streets of New York and LA and DC, there's increasingly little resistance from any quarter of American civil society or American institutions that can push back on that. And that's what's really so scary.
Mm. Yeah, it is.
I'm not the guest you have on to have a happy chat and
That's definitely not our vibe. Don't worry. This is the home for the skunk at the picnic.
Glad to be here.
Well, I wanted to ask you about that now because I mean, there is, I think, a real mismatch between what you are describing, particularly what is happening at home and how that is being viewed, particularly by the United States traditional allies like Australia, and particularly elite policymakers and security circles, I suppose. A lot of it is still met with disbelief and really, I think, a deep misunderstanding. And we see that particularly in Australia around, I'm sure, in the week that you've been here, you've heard a lot about the AUKUS nuclear-powered submarine deal that's on everybody's minds. And there is still this drive in Australia to see the United States as we've traditionally seen it, as, our most important security ally and as a relationship more broadly that is above domestic politics. It's above prime ministers, it's above presidents, and it has a kind of locked in bipartisan consensus. This is perhaps an unfair question, but why do you think it's so apparently difficult for the United States traditional allies like Australia to see what it is you are describing, to see what is happening in the United States for what it is?
Well, I do think people do see it. I mean, I have found too much kind of sweeping it under the rug since I've been here this week. I think it's more that two things can be true at the same time. It's very scary, and also there's not an alternative. So what are you to do if you are Japan or South Korea or a NATO country, right? I mean, I think it's the conversation is the most advanced in Europe because of the war in Ukraine. And I do think that there is a serious recognition that there needs to be some, presidents since Eisenhower have been pushing NATO to spend more, do more, stand up for their own defense. So that's not like Trump is not wrong about that in the abstract, right? That, or at least he's not out of step with history in that regard. All of the presidents have accused NATO countries, non-U.S. NATO countries, of free riding. Similarly, I mean, maybe to a lesser extent, Asian allies, but certainly NATO.
And trust me, I say this with all humor. If American democracy can survive 10 years of Greta Thunberg scolding, you guys can survive a few months of Elon Musk. But what no democracy, American, German, or European, will survive is telling millions of voters that their thoughts and concerns, their aspirations, their pleas for relief are invalid or unworthy of even being considered.
But the dramatic, sending J.D. Vance to the Munich Security Conference and saying that, Europe has a free speech problem and they need to let in the far right in Germany. I mean, that's just a dramatic departure. Asking every single one of those countries to spend 5%. I mean, there's some countries that can and should, and then there are other countries like spend it on what, right? Not all of these countries can build tanks, nor should they. Estonia has a very sort of, well-developed cyber, they're very good in that space. It's a sort of a comparative advantage, but Trump doesn't believe in comparative advantage, right? And so I think, so there is a recognition that this time is different. They're building, they're investing in defense, but it's not going to happen overnight. And so in the short run, there's no substitute for the United States unless it's China. And even that is not really a substitute in the same way, obviously, even just capability wise. So absent another global power that can project power in two regions, I think it's more a pragmatic, what do we do in this perilous moment of transition before we have the capabilities to really act without the United States as a backstop. And I think there's uncertainty about what will happen in 2026 in the midterms. There's uncertainty about what will happen in the 2028 election. And that's irrespective of whether Trump tries to stay in office. I mean, it's unclear whether we have two functioning parties anymore. And it's healthy to have two functioning parties and to have some alternation and some expectation that policies will outlive an administration of one party, right? And right now we don't have, it's just the unreliability of the United States at the moment that I think is also, it's just introducing, it's only been 8 months. It feels like 100 years, but it's only been 8 months. So I don't know. I have a fair amount of sympathy for some of the allies who are attempting to get their heads around it at a time when they cannot afford to have a breach, right, and lose their most, their powerful patron. In the security realm, at least. That's, so.
Yeah, I mean, I think there is a tendency not so much in Europe, but in Australia in particular, to see our security in a binary framing, that it's either protection from the United States or, the very next day we're living under Chinese communist dictatorship. And so there is a tendency, I think, to conflate US interests when it comes to China with Australian interests, when in fact our interests are quite different for historical and cultural and political and geographical reasons. I'm interested there, because you mentioned China and because China is so kind of ever present in Australian foreign policy in our conversations about our US alliance as well, how you see the Trump administration's approach to China.
I don't think we know yet. I think that's a big question mark. I mean, I think there's always interagency tensions about policies, major policies. In this case, I think you have a president who is not concerned with the details and who doesn't really value allies. And I don't know where he puts, it's a little unclear where he puts Taiwan in that space, right? We don't have a defense pact with Taiwan. Although I did a survey for my most recent book and I asked, a large sample of Americans, does the United States have a defense pact that obligates the United States to fight in Taiwan's defense if it is attacked by China? And 80% of people said that the answer was yes, we do have this defense pact. Yeah.
Wow.
So, and of course, the correct answer is no, we do not. We have what's known as strategic ambiguity, where we don't say if we're going to defend Taiwan, but we are obligated by law to give to sell Taiwan weapons for its own defense. And of course, the Taiwan contingency is a major focus, has been for decades, of U.S. military planning, and increasingly so, right? So there are some in the Trump administration who really want to focus only on the Taiwan contingency and the Indo-Pacific in general. And, the China threat is the pacing threat, and to the exclusion, really, of dealing with Russia and Europe. That's one view. It's not the only view. And I think it's not necessarily widely shared within the government. And it's caused some tension where, there have been statements coming from certain quarters that, the Europeans should not stay in their own region and not do cooperation with Indo-Pacific allies, Indo-Pacific U.S. allies. But this is a world in which, in the Cold War, the Soviet Union and the United States had no real trading relationship to speak of. They were not economically interdependent at all. And here you have, a major source of the problem is that, China is economically integrated with Europe, with Australia, with, as you know, I'm sure know better than I do, the raw data, but and the United States, right? And so it presents an interdependence problem that is much more complicated in some ways in terms of resolving security tensions. And so I think that the Trump administration there are camps, but the decider is always the president. And in this case, he's really got competing impulses, right? He doesn't much care for alliances. In the past, he said, what do we get out of having Taiwan as an ally, even though officially they are not really, not formally. We don't have a formal defense pact with them. But he also is a big fan of Xi Jinping and yet also is putting tariffs and trying to. So one wonders if he has a grand bargain in mind, some sort of, again, making
another
peace
summit.
and like another summit. And so what will China want out of that deal? My guess is something to do with Taiwan. And so I don't think we know yet I think there are forces pulling in both directions, hawkish and more sort of accommodating and commercially focused. Time will tell. I don't think we really know. It's one of the big question marks, I think. One of the biggest question marks that's hanging over the Trump foreign policy.
Mm. Given those huge question marks, those tensions, and all of that you've outlined about Trump's imperial revival, what he's doing abroad and what he's doing at home, having spent a week also in Australia in one of the United States' traditional allies, what do you think it's important for the United States allies to understand about Trump and what he is doing? What do you want to leave Australians with after, spending time here and spending so much time so closely observing the Trump administration?
I think the biggest mistake that allies maybe, especially in Europe, made was to breathe a sigh of relief after Trump was gone the first time. And I think that was a missed opportunity to do things like invest in defense and so forth. And they seem to recognize that. Again, I think the European conversation is further along because of the invasion of Ukraine, which was very much, I definitely had the sense that the war in Ukraine was a wake-up call in the Indo-Pacific as well. And, again, shows the interconnectedness and the rise of Russia-China cooperation, and with North Korea sending troops to Ukraine and to Russia. It is, in that sense, the interconnectedness is quite recognized already. I would say this time the volatility is so much greater, and his Russia policy and Ukraine policy has veered 180 degrees at least 2 or 3 times in the last 8 months. I lose count, right?
Yeah.
I do also think, and I tried to force myself occasionally to remember some of the things that have happened that we've already forgotten about, that in any other administration would be, the biggest scandal of the defining scandal of a presidency. So things like the humiliation of Cyril Ramaphosa, the president of South Africa, when he came to visit. I mean, that was just appalling. And Ramaphosa handled it about as well as it could be handled, given that it happened. But, it was just like all based on misinformation and, So there's that. But I think you can't really. I also remind myself of the territorial integrity, the threats against Canada, the threats against Greenland, which is these are two NATO allies, territorial threats against two NATO allies. And just yesterday or last night, I don't know, the days get a bit confusing, but in Europe, I think yesterday, Denmark summoned the U.S. ambassador because apparently they have found Americans doing influence operations in Greenland. I mean, this is just unfathomable, right? And the visit of the South Korean president this week was also telling because it began with this bizarre Trump Truth Social post about, the government raiding churches or something. And I missed the actual details of it while I was flying over here, so I may not have the details quite right. But it was another one of these conspiracy theories that Trump just puts on social media. And if you know anything about how diplomacy works and how alliances work, every word of the communications is usually workshopped to death, and it's boring. And it's the sort of thing you would read to yourself to put yourself to sleep if you had insomnia, right? But it exists for a reason, to avoid this volatile, odd signals, random signals, that take up a lot of time to kind of put back in the bottle. And I would just say, be very wary of the good. A good deal that seems like a good deal on the day could be upended the next day, and be ready for some pretty extreme volatility, because we've observed it in most of the rest of the world already in the first 8 months.
Well, I mean, I don't think we're ready, but you're right that we should be. Elizabeth, thank you so much for your time and generosity, and I hope we'll be able to talk to you again.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you for having me. It's been a wonderful week here.
I'm so glad. It's our pleasure. Thanks so much for joining us for this week's episode. If you want to read more from the Australia Institute, you can order the second edition in our Vantage Point series. Dead Centre, How Political Pragmatism is Killing Us by Richard Dennis argues that the quest for the sensible centre in Australian politics is pointless and flies in the face of evidence. You can buy Richard's essay for $19.95 or become a subscriber to the Vantage Point series via our website, australiainstitute.org.au/store, or tap the link in the show notes. This episode was recorded on Thursday, the 28th of August. After America is supported by the Andrew Farron Foundation and produced by Angus Blackman. We'll be back next week. I'm Emma Shortis. Thanks for listening.